I'm Algenon Cash, and you're locked in. Welcome back. Thank y'all for joining me for yet another great episode. And as always, I always think every episode is great because we've always got a really good conversation that we're going to bring to you. As you know, with our show, we try to take what's happening in the news day to day and educate and empower and inspire you. Make sure you actually know what's going on. There's so much false information that's circulating around out there. Even sometimes when you listen to like the legitimate media sources, whatever your favorite news network might be, sometimes you don't always understand exactly what's going on with so many of these issues that you hear so much about. So I pride myself on trying to bring you good content and experienced people to try to educate you and give you the insight on what's really going on. And so we've got a new president, Joe Biden, 46th president of the United States of America, and he is already off to work. 35 executive orders just in a matter of 1 week. Just to give you a comparison, our former president Trump only signed 5 executive orders in the first week, and President Obama, who we thought was the executive order in chief, only signed 7. And so Joe Biden has bumped that number up by 500% just in the matter of the week alone. And one item or one issue that you've heard me talk about, something that I've been very passionate about, even something that I worked on extensively for many years, is the Keystone Pipeline and just the energy security of our country. It's so important that we are not relying on foreign countries for our own energy security and domestic energy production. And we've been able to make such great progress in the many years leading up to this point. And it does seem like right now, currently with the new administration, some of that work is being undone. So I wanted to invite a good friend of mine, someone that I worked with in the past, David McGowan. David, I've known him for many, many years. Actually met him when he was doing some lobbying work for the North Carolina Real Estate Commission. Then he went over to the American Petroleum Institute, and now he's like the big guy in charge. He's leading the Southeast region for API and helping so many of us to understand what's going on with these really complex issues. Mr. McGowan, how are you, man? How you been doing?
Algenon, great to see you. Thank you for this opportunity to talk with you today and speak with your audience and hopefully educate a little bit on the energy and specifically the natural gas and oil issues that are important in our country right now. So really appreciate this opportunity, bud.
Well, it's good to reconnect with you. And as I said off air, I want to say on air in front of my audience, congratulations on the position that you're carrying now. I'm sure on some days it doesn't feel like it's a promotion, might feel like a demotion. You wish you were doing a lot more, lot less. But I know you, and I know how hard you work. I know how much you care about the work that you're doing and the people that you're serving. So congratulations. I know without a shadow of a doubt, you are the right person for the job.
Thank you, Algenon, very much.
So, man, I'm gonna jump in. I know we got limited time, and it's late in the day, and I know you got family ready to get off to the dinner table and all those great things. But let's just kick off with Keystone Pipeline. I think that's probably the issue that going back now, all the way back to 2014. This has been an ongoing issue. Something that I think not only my audience but people across the country would be familiar with. Our newly amended president has already came in and signed an executive order and halted the construction of the Keystone Pipeline. I think up to, correct me if I'm wrong on the numbers, I believe TransCanada has already invested around 4.8 or 4.9 billion dollars in developing the pipeline. The new administration has caused that to cease. Maybe let's start off and talk a little bit about what the impact of stopping the pipeline. What does that mean in terms of jobs and even the safety around how we transport the oil from Canada?
Well, first of all, Algenon, again, just thank you for this opportunity. Great to talk with you about these issues. Again, feel like they're incredibly important for the nation as a whole, and specifically even for here in North Carolina. Although Keystone doesn't have direct impacts here in North Carolina per se, it's a big project for our country. It's a symbolic project in many respects, as we've seen on really. It's become such a political football over the last, roughly 8 years or so, as you discussed. But really, unfortunately, the President Biden's decision to cancel the permits for revoke the permits for the Keystone XL pipeline is ironically, it's a step backwards, both from an environmental progress standpoint as well as from an economic recovery standpoint. I think we all know, or at least those who are familiar with the industry are aware, and hopefully we're getting the word out that pipelines really are the safest and most environmentally friendly way to transport energy. And as we all know, the economy really can't recover and thrive unless we're able to deliver and provide affordable, reliable energy to our citizens and to our economy. Um, Again, as you talked about, Keystone specifically has been through more than 10 years of very extensive environmental reviews, both at the federal level, at the individual states level, in the states that the pipeline would traverse. Um, and really, this is a project that is necessary for our country and our country's energy security and our country's energy reliability. And the bottom line, really, with all of this is that revoking Keystone and the subsequent decisions that we hear the president may announce tomorrow, which would implement a federal leasing ban on new oil and gas leases in the United States, these two decisions in conjunction with one another are essentially a policy that will guarantee that we will not be energy secure in this country and that we will be importing more oil into this country from areas around the world that, number one, don't have the same environmental protections in place as it relates to production and transport of these products. And number two, quite honestly, it really isn't to our advantage from a geopolitical standpoint. I mean, a lot of these countries where we are importing product from don't necessarily have the best interest of the United States of America in mind. So there are a number of implications that go into to this decision, not the least of which is also the jobs component, as you mentioned, somewhere in the neighborhood of 10,000 union jobs basically being taken off the table with the stroke of the president's pen. So a lot of really concerning aspects of this decision. And unfortunately, as we know, much of it is symbolic and political in nature.
If you're just now joining us, I'm Algenon Cash. You are locked in. Also locked in with me today is David McGowan, who is with the American Petroleum Institute. And we are talking about domestic energy and just energy security in our country. If you have any questions, you can certainly leave those in the chat section. I'll try to work those in within the course of our conversation. David, I agree with you. I think a lot of not only this executive order related to Keystone is political theater. I think, quite frankly, the 35 executive orders that we've seen signed in the matter of 7 days is also a lot of political theater. My audience may not understand this, and when you say it's safer, and I say it's safer to transport oil through a pipeline, many people don't understand if Canada is not using a pipeline to deliver the oil, that doesn't mean the oil is not coming. It's still going to come here. It's just going to come on rail car. It's going to come by waterway. It's going to come. It could come by truck. It's going to come by a number of other means outside of that pipeline. But I think you could go back and you could make a strong case that it's certainly much safer to transport it through pipeline, which leads to a greater degree of explosion and all these other things that you could see if you're using all these other means to transfer the product. I would also argue that it's safer for the environment simply because if you're using rail car or you're using truck, if you're using a ship, you're also actually contributing more pollution to the environment.
Absolutely.
Whereas with the pipeline, you're not actually doing that. David, one thing that I think so many people are unaware of is that Canada is actually one of our largest trading partners when it comes to energy. If we cancel this pipeline after TransCanada has invested $4.8 billion into the pipeline, I've already heard some rumors that TransCanada plans to sue the United States government. What impact does that have on the trading relationship that we have with our neighbor?
Well, that's a great observation, and I think it will have an impact. I think the reality is that the Canadians have been good neighbors, have been good allies for us. Um, they've got a product that we need, and we have the ability to get that product here. And so I think number one, obviously, from a political international relations standpoint, um, it's important that we maintain those good trade relationships with Canada, and specifically as it relates to natural gas and oil products. I think the other key piece to this is, again, we've got an opportunity in the case of Keystone here, to import product from one of our neighbors, again, who, at least from an environmental standpoint, is conscious of the environmental impacts, the potential environmental impacts of oil production in their country, but also recognize that the United States needs a steady, reliable source of supply from a country that at least shares our interests more than many others do around the world, many others where we currently import product from. And so, again, as you mentioned, I mean, this is, in our respect, it's almost a no brainer. It's an opportunity to further develop the trading relationship between our two countries. It's an opportunity to share and continue to build on the environmental progress that our two countries are making. And it's an opportunity to support the economy of our two countries as well. So there's a lot of really positive implications that would result from the construction and operation of Keystone. And so, again, we're disappointed in the decision that the president's made here, and I know the Canadians are.
You mentioned that there's another executive order making its way down the pipeline. No pun intended there, but looks like the president will be banning any further permits on federal land. Right now, I think somewhere around 10% of domestic energy production comes from federal land. What are you hearing within your industry trade groups in terms of how does the industry feel about the ban from additional permits on federal land?
Sure. Very concerned about it. Very concerned about, again, the implications short term, but really long term. What does that mean for the United States and our ability to maintain our energy independence and our energy security? Um, Algenon, as you know, being familiar with the industry, there are long lead times on the projects, both onshore and offshore, that our member companies at the American Petroleum Institute um, put into these projects. I mean, they're not 2 and 3 year projects in most cases, and in some cases, they could be a decade long. And so the regulatory certainty that's necessary to enable those projects to move forward is critically important. Obviously, if we're not producing here in the United States, and I think the percentage of federal lands production is actually up around 16% now. So it's a pretty significant chunk of the oil and natural gas that we consume here in the United States. You take that offline, or at least limit any new production on federal lands going forward, then again, that's just a recipe that means that we're going to be importing that product from other countries around the world, rather than creating jobs and economic development here through the production of those products here at home, rather than having those products produced under the stringent environmental regulations that we have here in the United States that are second to none of anywhere in the world. So again, this decision is a recipe for importing more oil and natural gas here to the United States. And it's problematic from a number of respects, both short term and long term.
The argument that the Biden administration is making that some of these executive orders and these changes in rules and regulations are needed to combat climate change. I know my audience is probably on the fence whether or not they believe in climate change, and that's not particularly what I want to debate. I'm more interested in identifying these changes in the rules. Do they actually have the impact to mitigating climate change as much as it's being pushed out of the administration? I'd love for you to react to that. And then also, another executive order that's been passed is that we are returning to the Paris climate change accords. At the end of the day, all these things we're doing, is it really enough to move the needle on mitigating climate change globally?
Again, I think you hit on one of the concerns that we have as an industry, and the American Petroleum Institute specifically, in that we recognize that the climate is changing. We recognize the role that man plays in that. But we also feel very strongly that natural gas and oil industry, and natural gas and oil as products, um, can be a huge part of the solution to our climate challenges. We've already seen that, Algenon, for instance, as you know, in the significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and the significant improvements we've seen in our air quality here in the United States over the last 15 years or so, due specifically to the use of natural gas and the switching from coal-fired power plants to natural gas power plants. Here in North Carolina, those impacts have been particularly impactful. We've seen our emissions drop over 20% here in North Carolina over the last 10 years. And again, that's almost exclusively due to the use of the greater deployment and use of natural gas here in the state for electricity generation. And so we've got tremendous opportunities within this industry. We've got the technological know-how, we've got the financial wherewithal, and we've got the will to put our minds at work, and the industry's minds at work, to help solve the challenges that lie ahead as it relates to climate. And I think from the industry's perspective, we recognize that we've got to have a seat at the table. We've got to be involved in the discussions and the debate. And quite frankly, we have a lot to offer as the discussions and the debate move forward. I think generally speaking, the Paris Agreement, for instance, we support the principles behind that, but we're also very concerned about the fact that the United States can't be in a position where we put ourselves at a disadvantage in our ability to compete in the global economy. And so we've got to ensure that we're holding the other signatories to those agreements to account, and that they're following through on the commitments that they've made as well. We certainly don't want to do anything that's going to handicap our economy and our ability to continue to grow as a nation when other countries aren't similarly carrying their weight. And so I think that the Biden administration sees that a lot of these policies that they've announced in the last couple of days and are likely to announce in the coming days, they believe that the culmination of all of those and the combination of all of those will lead to significant positive impacts from a climate standpoint. And perhaps they will. And again, we applaud many of the actions they're taking. We personally feel like that the market innovation and technological innovation and voluntary actions that the industry has taken are more appropriate mechanisms to drive innovation and drive addressing the challenges that we face, rather than government regulation and putting the thumb on the scale in favor of certain energy sources at the expense of other energy sources. And so we want to see a level playing field, and we believe that natural gas and oil can play a large role in helping us meet the goals that we have as it relates to climate and greenhouse gas emissions reductions going forward.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I've always said that at the end of the day, the only real way to address the climate change issue is you've got to really take a hard look at how we're meeting baseload energy demand. And still, based on what I know, nearly 70% of baseload energy demand is still met through fossil fuel technology, whether that's coal, oil, natural gas, whatever you say. However, I am a proponent for what we call an all of the above strategy. We should be looking at all these energy sources, whether it be fossil fuels, renewables, even nuclear, you name it. We should be deploying everything that's available to make sure that we can meet that baseload energy demand. But when you think about actual utility energy generation, that's probably the area that's having the most impact on climate. And so if we're going to address that, we need to be doing it through really taking a hard look at our energy infrastructure in terms of how we meet that baseload demand. I also agree with you that natural gas has been a great way to create that bridge to sort of a brighter energy future, as I've always called it, because natural gas burns 50% cleaner. You've got utility companies like Duke Energy that have deployed what they call combined combustion cycle plants, where they're using natural gas and steam versus using coal. So I do think you're right. I think that a lot of energy producers and power generators have been doing this voluntarily, and quite frankly, they're doing it voluntarily because it does help the environment, but it also helps the bottom line. It's
Absolutely.
actually a lot more efficient and effective for them to use natural gas than coal, and I think you see utility companies moving that direction. But one thing that has allowed that movement to happen is hydraulic fracturing. Now, I know for a lot of people, if you're not familiar with the process, it sounds very new to you. You might have just heard it for the first time in the last few years, the last decade. It's actually a process that's been around 65 years. Give me an update on what's going on with fracking right now here in the country. Is that something that still is still happening in mass around the country?
It absolutely is, Algenon. I don't know the percentage off the top of my head, but I think in the neighborhood of 90+% of the natural gas that's produced in the United States right now is produced via hydraulic fracturing technology. So the fact of the matter is that if the president were to issue an executive order, for instance, that were to ban fracking, as was much discussed during the campaign, and there was a lot of flip flopping by the president and his campaign on that issue. But if there were to be a fracking ban, nationwide fracking ban, for instance, then that essentially would have the effect of stopping all natural gas production. And obviously, the implications of that would be profound, both economically and environmentally. So that's really not the answer. Hydraulic fracturing has been around for a long time, as you recognize. The technologies continue to be improved, is continuously being improved. And the fact of the matter is that it's the hydraulic fracturing technology paired with the horizontal drilling technology that really allowed for the efficient recovery and production of the resource, lessened the environmental impact, the surface impact, lessened the footprint of the wells and the well pads on the surface, and led to the energy renaissance that we saw really beginning around 2008 and continuing here today. Obviously, production in the United States for both natural gas and oil has slowed down considerably over the last year or so. Just before COVID last year, we hit a record production number in the United States where we were producing, I think, in a little over 13 million barrels a day of oil product. That was by far and away made us the largest producer of oil in the world. We were also the largest producer of natural gas in the world at the time. So that's slowed down a little bit. Drilling permits have slowed down with the prices falling as much as they did over the last year. But we're beginning to see recovery in the rig counts, particularly in Texas and some of the other more productive basins across the country. And the fact of the matter is, again, hydraulic fracturing is a safe, proven, effective technology that allows us to produce the natural gas that our country is consuming for power generation, for home heating, for home cooking, and quite frankly, for tremendous amounts of manufacturing of raw materials and goods here in the United States now.
Hey, if you're just now joining us, I'm Algenon Cash. You are locked in. I'm your host. I've also got David McGowan with the American Petroleum Institute. He's also locked in with us today. There's still a little bit of time left. If you got any questions, certainly leave those in the chat section. I do see that there's been a lot of comments in the chat section. I appreciate you all joining us for this conversation. But if you do have questions, leave those in the chat, and I'll try to work them in before we wrap up here. You know, David, here as I get ready to go into wrap up mode, I want to pivot and come back home to North Carolina. I know you do a lot of work. I know you do a lot of work throughout the Southeast, but you really started your role with API here in North Carolina. I know at one time we were pushing really hard to get the Atlantic Outer Continental Shelf open for offshore energy exploration. I was actually optimistic and hopeful that would happen in the Trump administration. It did not. Where do we stand right now with more offshore energy in the Atlantic?
So, Algenon, that was very much a hot topic of conversation, really, from when I started in the API role in 2013 on through last year. Um, the president initially indicated his support for increasing access to offshore waters, both in the Atlantic as well as in the Gulf of Mexico and even off the coast of Alaska. And then ultimately, as the administration moved on and we approached the 2020 election cycle, it became clear that political considerations were very much a factor in the president's approach to allowing offshore drilling in the eastern Gulf of Mexico and off the Atlantic coast, the southeast Atlantic. Ultimately, early last year, the president implemented a moratorium on any new offshore activity on the east coast of Florida, as well as off the east coast of Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina. That effectively placed a moratorium on any potential oil and gas development off the coast. And it appears that if President Biden goes through with the executive order that he's rumored to announce tomorrow, which would implement a federal leasing ban on any new oil and gas leases on federal lands, that would apply as well to both offshore and onshore lands and would have the effect of prohibiting any kind of offshore, any kind of new offshore development in the Gulf of Mexico and any kind of offshore development at all in the Atlantic, which is purely a frontier area at this point, where there's been really very limited industry activity. So the fact of the matter is, I think at this point in time, it's very unlikely that we'll see any kind of offshore natural gas and oil exploration or development activity off the Atlantic coast anytime soon. That could always change at some point in the future with another administration, but I think for the foreseeable future, it's pretty well off the table.
And I think that's terrible for North Carolina residents. That offshore energy development had the potential to create 100,000, if not more, and I mean, well-paying jobs right here in our state. And I think every year that we continue to kick that can down the road and not pursue it more in earnest, we're actually doing harm to the North Carolina economy. Now, our governor, Governor Roy Cooper, who just got reelected for a second term, he has pledged to really try to combat and get more involved with the climate change initiative right here in our state. What does that look like going forward, David? What if, when the governor says that, what should North Carolina residents be prepared for?
Well, I think on a number of fronts, we've seen the governor be very active, as you mentioned, in the climate and clean energy space, really starting with his release of Executive Order 80, which was his climate and clean energy executive order, and really laid the foundation for his administration's work on these issues. Um, we've seen some recent conversations about North Carolina's and specifically the governor's administration's interest in having North Carolina join the Georgetown Transportation and Climate Initiative, which is an emissions reduction program for the transportation sector. That would essentially layer on another gas tax on top of the existing state and federal gas tax that would be substantial, probably raise the cost of gasoline and diesel fuel and other refined petroleum products like jet fuel, anywhere from 20 to 40 cents a gallon potentially. So that's one thing that we're watching very closely here in North Carolina is the potential for North Carolina to participate in that Georgetown Transportation and Climate Initiative. I think the one thing to watch here is while the governor is very committed to these issues and is doing a lot from his administration standpoint and with his agencies to move the ball forward, it really is going to take buy-in from the legislature. And the legislature obviously controls the purse strings. And we've seen a lot of debates between the governor and the legislature over who controls those and what the governor is able to implement and not. And so I think it's going to be very intriguing to watch this interplay between the Republican controlled General Assembly and obviously Democrat Governor Roy Cooper specifically as it relates to these climate and clean energy issues. I think they may be able to find some common ground specifically on the clean energy issues and deploying more solar and wind energy here in the state and battery storage and things of that nature. But when it comes to the emissions reduction programs, potential additional taxes like a TCI tax, potential programs that would apply to the power sector and emissions reductions like the regional greenhouse gas initiative that Virginia signed on to, I think the governor is likely to find a lot more pushback from the legislature on those types of programs. So something we'll be watching very closely and following as this year's session plays out and as we go through the rest of the governor's term.
Yeah, and I hope that he gets a lot of pushback from actual North Carolina residents. I think people need to really understand when we sign on to these initiatives and these pacts that generate more fees, more taxes, and we, in my argument, artificially increase the cost of energy. The reality is that we do that on the backs of low income and minority residents who are paying a higher disproportionate share of their discretionary income already for energy. And by artificially increasing that cost, we actually make it a lot harder for them to keep the lights on and keep gas in the car and do the things that they need to do just to be able to go through their ordinary lives. And we also impact jobs that actually affect, again, our low income residents and a lot of times our minority residents. So I hope it's not just the legislature that's pushing back on the governor. I pray that North Carolina residents take heed and do the same. I do have one question I do want to work in before I let you go, David. I got a question from the audience that says, with this executive order, and I'm assuming he's talking about with the Biden administration, when does it really go into effect? Basically, what are the meat and potatoes of how does this happen? I think he just wants to understand better what's the process now that the executive order has been signed.
So, in Algenon, is he talking about, the Keystone executive order or the federal leasing ban? We clear on which one that is?
He doesn't say, but I think he's probably just trying to clarify with executive orders generally, whether it be Keystone or the ban on permits on federal land. Once we hear the announcement of the executive order, what happens next? What does that process look like?
So, very good question, and I'll admit that I'm not an expert on federal government regulatory processes and executive authority. What I do think will happen, specifically as it relates to Keystone and probably with the federal leasing ban as well, is that you will see some form of legal challenges to those executive orders. I think it's also in the case of the federal leasing ban, from what we understand, and again, it's yet to be announced, that it may come out as soon as tomorrow, but that it will be a temporary suspension of the permitting of any new leases on federal lands, to allow the Department of Interior essentially the current leasing process and to determine whether any changes need to be made. So there is at least a possibility that it could be a short-term pause to allow them to catch their breath and implement some of their own policies that they want to see as a part of the process. And then they could potentially reinstate federal leasing under a new process with new requirements in place. Again, all of that yet to be determined. But I think the likelihood is that we're going to see some potential legal challenges to both of these executive orders. And I think that from as far as other implications, it's going to take some time potentially to see, particularly with the leasing ban, to see the negative consequences that result. And so that's one of the concerning aspects about it, is that those consequences may not be immediately evident, but they're going to be evident down the road. And by the time that we actually see the impacts and the negative results, that it may be too late to go back and address the problem. And so that's a great question. I don't know that I've answered it directly, but I think there's still a lot of uncertainty as to how exactly this is going to play out and what the real practical effect will be.
Well, no, I think you answered the question, and I think the answer you gave also speaks to the uncertainty that I've argued that gets created when you use the executive order process. to try to legislate and not actually work through Congress and get the buy-in from actual legislators when you're trying to enact these kind of rules and regulations. It just creates more uncertainty, and the industry and others don't really know what to prepare for. David, man, I appreciate you joining me for this. I really do. It was a quick conversation, but I learned some things. I know my audience learned some things. I want to keep the invitation out there. I know President Biden's going to be really active here in his first 100 days. We have no idea what he may try to do through Congress. So at some point here within the next 90 so days, I may want to get you back on, or at least somebody back on from the American Petroleum Institute, to break all this down and help me and my audience to continue to follow along, man. But I appreciate you doing this.
Algenon, thank you so much for the opportunity. Always great to talk with you. I thank you for your audience and their attention and interest in these issues. Really do appreciate this opportunity and can't wait to do it again real soon.
Awesome, man. I appreciate it again. And for my audience, go check out the American Petroleum Institute. They are the largest industry trade organization representing a lot of oil and gas companies throughout the country. They got a lot of great education and information available on their website. Go follow them on Twitter, connect with them, and you can get just as educated on a lot of the things that David and I was talking about tonight. Before I wrap up with you all, before I let you go, just some things that I want you to keep in mind. As you've heard me mention a couple times, the Biden administration has now passed 35 executive orders, 35 and counting. And you may see more coming out tomorrow. If you listen to our conversation tonight, and we talked a little bit about the legal challenges that can come out, we've already seen some legal challenges coming out of Texas related to the immigration, the pause on deportations that the Biden administration has already passed. A federal judge has come out and placed a hold on that, and basically said that that order is not going to be able to go into effect, at least not immediately. And that's what you run into, I think, when you're constantly using executive orders to legislate. You create a lot of judicial activism, where all of a sudden judges have become a lot more important than actual legislators. And I think that this is a misguided approach that the Biden administration has taken out the gate. They need to try to work through Congress. I know it may be hard, but it's something that they need to do. And we've not passed any substantive legislation in this country, probably going back to 2010, which is the Affordable Care Act. Basically, everything Obama did in the second term was pretty much through executive order. Trump used the executive order quite a bit in his administration, and it does appear that President Biden plans to do the same thing. The real issue with that is that you create a sense of political whiplash, where industry and so many others don't know what to expect, because these things are constantly getting overturned by the next administration that's coming in. So my biggest advice to my audience is keep an eye on that. Make sure that you're watching whether or not we're seeing real legislation happen and not just these executive orders. Also, I think you're going to be hearing more about this $1.9 trillion stimulus bill from some of the folks I'm talking to in DC. It doesn't sound like the president has the votes to get that bill through Congress. And so there's a good chance that's probably going to get scaled down quite a bit. And then I do think the impeachment trial that kicked off today is going to dominate a lot of energy and take a lot of the air out of the room as it relates to the upper chamber and the Senate. And I think it's going to create a little bit of disunity too. I think you're going to have Republicans in Congress that see this as a political witch hunt, and they're not going to be so open to working with their Democratic colleagues to get some really big things done, which is what we need right now. Going through this public health pandemic, the economic crisis that we're facing, and so many other things that we need to deal with as a country. So a lot for you all to keep up with, but hey, that's what I'm here for. So make sure you're following my page, stay up to speed with everything I'm talking about. Go follow the YouTube channel. That way you get notified anytime we're producing new interviews. As you know, I've got the podcast that's available on Apple, Stitcher, and Spotify. So go subscribe there. And if you really like the content that we're producing, you can always become a sponsor or an advertiser. So reach out to me. Obviously, your investment is what helps us keep all this good content production and research and development going. So I would love to have you as a supporter. You can also become an official subscriber and member of the Locked In community. Message me. I'd be happy to send you a link on how to do that. And then something that doesn't cost you anything. It doesn't cost you any money to give me a thumbs up on this interview tonight. So you can make sure you click like. You can also share it with a friend who was not able to join us. And as always, until next time, y'all stay locked in.